So an example of a price ceiling is rent control. So example, rent control. So this is a legal maximum that can be charged for an apartment or housing in general. So it's the example that you might be familiar with in terms of a price ceiling. So let's look at this graphically. We have price, or this is rent, I guess. We have quantity, so this is the number of units. This is rent, dollars. We have an upward sloping supply curve. The higher you can charge in rent, the more quantity supplied of apartments are going to be available. And the demand curve is downward sloping because the lower the rent, the more quantity demanded there is for units. So let's say without government involvement, there's Q-star units, and they're charging, let's just make a nice even number, $1,500 for rent a month. And let's say that's, without any government intervention, this is how much like a 1-bedroom or something like that would be charged for. And then let's say the government comes along and sets a price ceiling or rent control, and that equals $1,200 a month. So the government's saying this is the most you can charge in rent every month is $1,200 for like a 1-bedroom apartment. Well, it's going to have these classic repercussions of a binding price ceiling. This is the quantity supplied, so this is the amount of apartments willing to supply at this price of $1,200. This is the quantity demanded. And so we have this shortage. And the quantity is going to go down. So, advocates for rent control are really trying to make sure everyone has access to affordable housing, regardless of their circumstance. And so that's why they're advocating for this. But if our assumptions of what this market looks like are correct, again, we have that caveat that we're kind of assuming that this is a competitive market, which I'm not saying that it is a competitive market, but what our model would predict is that a rent control below binding rent control, so rent control below $1,500 a month, such as $1,200 a month, is going to cause a shortage in apartments, and the amount of apartments actually available is going to go down. So these kind of unintended consequences of rent control we'll write it all out. So there's going to be a shortage. There's going to be a decrease in quality units. So if you can only charge $1,200 a month, then all of a sudden you might not be having a really nice unit. You might just kind of let it get more into disrepair and not repair it enough, not change the floors or the cupboards or paint it and things like that. There's also, sometimes management companies or owners will nickel and dime tenants. So, they'll charge them, hey, if you lose your key, I'm going to charge you $200 to replace it. Or they'll charge lots of money for little things, right? They'll try to make up this money somehow through weird charges and stuff like that. It also, usually we think it causing a decrease in long-term investment in apartments or housing, maybe in general, I should say. So developers, when they're thinking about, building more housing or apartment buildings or condos or whatever, are thinking about how much they can make in rent in the future. Is it going to make it worth it to build it? Or are people going to be willing to purchase these condos to rent them out or whatever if they can only get $1,200 rather than $1,500 a month? Well, that's, if they can only get 1,200 instead of 1,500, that's a lot of their future income is going to be a lot lower. And so it's going to be harder and harder to justify, the lower and lower this rent control is, harder to justify making new housing. So when you look at places that have had rent control for a long time, there's usually been more and more kind of housing shortages in those places and less long-term investment. Though there's multiple reasons for that in terms of, local controls and stuff like that about what can be built and all that kind of thing. But anyway, so here's an example of a price ceiling that you may be familiar with. So here's binding rent control. It's going to create a shortage. So it comes from a good place. We're trying to provide housing for all individuals in our society, but it's causing a shortage in the housing market and maybe has these unintended long-run consequences and these other consequences as well.